My name is Nick Valentino, and in case you were wondering why I would have any credibility on this topic, I don't know actually. My race and gender might make me more or less credible on this topic, depending on your perspective with regard to psychology. But I do have two very accomplished colleagues who are students in the department, Carly Wayne and Marzio Chino. Carly is here to help me answer all the difficult questions you might have about what exactly we've done here. So this is I'm really grateful to be here with you and with these other, my colleagues here. I'm really thrilled to see Tasha back from Texas, and her topic obviously informs the conversation that I'm going to have with you right now. The conversation I want to have starts with the notion that we've been thinking a lot about a couple of attitudinal predispositions that predict support for Trump, and we've been seeing a lot of news coverage of those predispositions. The first one is authoritarianism. For those of you who've been paying attention, not just to politics here in the United States, but also in Europe and other parts of the world, we see a rise in the popularity of authoritarian parties and candidates in various countries. And Trump is increasingly looking to many scholars and observers like that. And so we have the claims go from I would say somewhat, well, none of them are very modest. Actually, most of my colleagues making these claims make big claims. They say, actually, we don't need to know anything else about a person's attitudes other than their score on some measure of authoritarianism, and then we will know whether they will vote for Trump or Clinton in this race. So it's a very strong claim about the role of authoritarianism. Authoritarianism as a predisposition is the commitment to some stable hierarchy in society and to the role of authority in society, that we're better off if we have strong government, and a central government, and not a big government, but a strong government and strong leaders, and that people need to follow those leaders and obey. So there's a big debate about exactly how important authoritarianism is, but I would say right now the consensus is it's either really important or really, really, really important. That's the debate that's going on right now that I've seen. We can talk about whether you disagree with that. The other thing we talk a lot about is the role of emotion in this race, and we talk a lot about a particular emotion, and that is fear. And the idea actually in the debate here is that fear and authoritarianism interact, so that authoritarians, when they are afraid, when they're given some either existential or symbolic reason to be afraid of something in the environment, will be even more likely to support candidates like Trump and other authoritarian candidates and parties. So we have lots of articles in the mainstream media, but also in news magazines that talk a lot about these issues, and I'm sure many of you have read them. Sometimes scholars are cited. In fact, this is kind of a heyday for those of us who are in political psychology, because we keep, suddenly for many of us, people keep wanting to hear about our latest theories about fear and authoritarianism. So the notion here is that authoritarians might not jump on board with a candidate like Trump, except in certain circumstances, like the feelings of existential threat or economic threat that they may be perceiving in society today. And there's actually then a lot of debate about, well, do Americans and Europeans have any real reason to be so afraid? Actually, how bad is their economic situation? And is it really those people who are most economically threatened and therefore have the most reason to be anxious who are the ones that are flocking to Trump? And there's some debate about that. That's not going to be my focus today, although my colleagues and I are focusing on that in other work. Another argument that's made, and again, these are not really in any sense mutually exclusive, nor is the argument I'm going to make mutually exclusive to any of these, but there's a lot of work being done that suggests that actually it's not about authoritarianism or populism, it's about racial prejudice. It's just simply white folks who don't like non-white folks. And when we say non-white folks, we actually now are being quite inclusive. We mean African Americans, Latinos, people from other countries who might be considered a different race, even religious distinctions. So this is a general ethnocentrism is what's driving support for Trump and other authoritarian candidates and parties, right? So this is an argument about ethnocentrism in general, and we have articles like looking inside Donald Trump's soul. Is he a racist? Is an individual's racial conservatism or racism expressed, is that going to drive support for Trump? How did Trump happen? And the answer is because white voters want Trump to save the racial hierarchy that they used to have in the past, and want that to remain. So that's this argument. Now, and again, I don't think that anything I'm going to say rules all of those things out, but I just want to make it really clear about what the conventional wisdom boiled down is, I think. And that is, first, that fear and anxiety right now in our society and many others is heightened as a result of these economic crises, the recession and other threats to our economy. Again, we can debate whether that's realistic or is that any worse? Is it any worse now than it was in other periods when we didn't see candidates like this? Trump takes advantage of this and scapegoats immigrants and minorities in particular as responsible for these problems, and says that in order to solve those problems, we need to stop immigration, we need to stop Muslims. And he's adding, of course, threats from Muslim immigrants with regard to terrorism and into this mix. So it's not just economic woes, but it's also security, national security. A group of Americans who would score highly on some measure of authoritarianism are particularly susceptible to these arguments about fear. So the combination of authoritarianism and fear is really potent, and that drives support for Trump. Okay, so this is the basic conventional wisdom as I see it. I'm looking out on the faces of many of my experts in the audience and students, so we can talk about whether you think that's the correct conventional wisdom, but that's the way I'm going to put it. And standing against that, and I would say somewhat more muted, perhaps until very recently, is this other argument, which we haven't been paying as much attention to. And that is, there's a woman running for president. It's not just an authoritarian running for president, but there's actually also a woman running for president. And so it's a little hard sometimes to tease out the power and influence of attitudes about women from the power and influence of attitudes about, say, these other things, immigrants, non-whites, etc. So how does gender and sexism fit in terms of the overall explanation here for what's going on? We see stories like this left and right, and of course Clinton has a strong incentive to continue to play this play this kind of news up, which she did at the last debate. And of course, then here's where I will cite the same work that Tasha just was citing, and I'll actually defer to her on most of this issue. Fascinating stuff about the role of race in the gender gap. But if you just look at men and women, what you see is since about 1980, there's a big gender gap. Now, sexism and the gender gap are actually two very independent things. But I just wanted to talk to you about this gender gap for a second. We have a 10-point or so gap in 2012, which is close to the maximum difference, as Tasha pointed out. This year will probably exceed that by a substantial amount. It might be 14%, 15%. One of the recent polls I saw showed a 20% gap, whereas Romney Obama was 10%. Okay, so that's an almost insurmountable problem for Trump. We think, at least, he cannot win if there's a 20-point gender gap in the public. But that isn't exactly the point on the point. The point is, regardless of how men and women feel, how do people feel? How do people's attitudes about men and women drive their support for Trump? So our alternative is okay. So taking a step back, then there's a lot of focus on fear, and there's a lot of focus on ethnocentrism and authoritarianism. We actually think that a different dynamic entirely might be working, and that is that the primary catalytic emotion in this race is not fear. And in general, those people who are voting for Trump, when you talk to them and when you measure their attitudes, they're not expressing a lot of fear, actually. They're expressing a different emotion, and that is anger. And while that may seem, actually, to many people like a very small distinction, in political psychology, and to those of us who study this stuff a lot, it's a huge distinction between whether people are actually feeling anxious and whether they're just feeling angry. And what we think, actually, is that anger and not fear should catalyze the link between any of these predispositions, including sexism, and the vote. So we have that test to do, and then we have a second one, which I'll quickly show you, which is that really sexism is playing a much larger role than we currently have been discussing and assume, and that the relationship between anger and sexism has been ignored. And so I hope I can leave you with a little bit of a provocative argument that actually we shouldn't ignore sexism. It's probably not so provocative in this audience, but we shouldn't ignore gender attitudes, and we shouldn't ignore the interaction between emotion and gender predispositions when we think about this race, or actually any vote choice. So our quick theory suggests, and this is why I say that anger and not fear should be driving some of these relationships. If you look at various theories of emotion in politics, you will get the following distinction between anger and fear. First of all, political threats don't always trigger anxiety in the recipient, in the viewer. Sometimes political threats will trigger anger. When do they trigger anger? When there's a normative violation, when people are doing something they shouldn't do according to you. When they intended to do that, they did it on purpose. And when you think you have control over that situation and can prevent it from happening again, or can stop that group from doing that. So if you think, for example, that people of Muslim faith are coming to the United States intentionally to victimize innocent Americans, that's a normative violation that is intended, and the way to control it is to stop people from coming into this country who might do that. And that is an anger-based appraisal system that is going on in that situation. I could give you a bunch of different examples of it. What happens when you feel anger? You rely on your predispositions. You stop thinking hard. You don't think in depth about whether that's really the right conclusion to come to. You stop thinking when you're angry. You boost your solidarity with your in-group, because that's where you can derive protection and safety and security. And you actually increase the willingness to take policy risks in order to avoid losses. Okay, so you can increase the risk that you're willing to take to stop this threat from occurring when you're angry. And although you can't see that behind the panelists, if you look at the other panel, you can see the anxiety condition is just the opposite. You're actually likely to reduce your reliance on predispositions, to take a step back from the situation and start thinking harder, and maybe even consider alternative explanations from the one that you had previously thought of. You're more likely to be risk avoidant when you're afraid, and you're more likely to compromise. We've shown this, and several teams have shown this over and over in the political realm, but it's derived from appraisal theories of emotion and affective intelligence theory, and work that Brader and I and some other folks have done here. So that's our theory. We've done 3 studies. I'm not going to show you data from 3 studies. I'm going to show you just a couple of things. So first of all, let me show you the scales that we use. The first one is an ethnocentrism scale, which is a general outgroup ethnocentrism measure. You can see it's items like this one. In dealing with other ethnic and cultural groups, our first priority should be that we make sure we're the ones who end up gaining and the others, and not the ones who end up losing. So this is an in-group versus out-group. It doesn't specify which group is which. It doesn't say blacks and whites. And we did that on purpose because we live in a multicultural society now, and there's lots of groups to dislike if you so choose, okay? Or to prefer less than your own group. Authoritarianism, there are a number of qualities that people feel children should have. This is a measure of authoritarianism that has nothing to do with politics. This is how you raise your kids. If you want your kids to be respectful, to have good manners, and to be obedient rather than independent and curious and self-reliant, then you are higher in authoritarianism. And that measure has been used repeatedly, and it has been shown that it's a very good predictor of candidate support for people like Trump, as well as for candidates in Europe, like the Front National and Le Pen and candidates in other countries as well. So it's a very good predictor of support for authoritarian parties and candidates. Lastly, we have a hostile sexism scale, which just basically taps into whether you think feminism is about women getting ahead of men, not being equal to men, but actually getting ahead of men, taking advantage of men, and actually dominating men. And if you believe those things, then we predict you will be less likely to support, you will be less likely to support Clinton and more likely to support Trump. Okay? So, first of all, what we find when we look at a nationally representative sample is that, at least in this sample, authoritarians are somewhat more likely to support Trump, but not substantially more likely. The biggest effect we get actually is with this hostile sexism measure, controlling for party ID and ideology, which also have an influence. So ethnocentrism and sexism are rivals. Sexism is not a minor contributor here. It's a big predictor of support for Trump. And it's nearly as important, and in some cases more important than ethnocentrism is. And if you look at men and women separately, what you find is it's especially powerful for men, perhaps not surprisingly. It's less powerful for women, and in fact, ethnocentrism mildly beats it among women as a predictor of support for Trump. Okay, so these dots and lines are the size of the coefficient of this predisposition, sexism, as a predictor of support for Trump. So the further to the right the dot, the stronger the predictor is, and more positive. So high numbers mean sexists are more likely to support Trump. I'm going on too long. How much time do I have?
1 minute.
1 minute, okay. So I only have 3 more slides. So we find sexism is more powerful than authoritarianism. The last thing I want to show you is the role that emotion is playing here. Remember that we predict anger and not fear is going to drive the power of these predispositions up. And fears should, according to our theory, actually be driving the power of these predispositions down. I'm going to just show you one example. So we ran an experiment. If you want to test the power of emotion on as a catalyst, as an independent variable, you have to trigger emotion, in my team's opinion anyway. It would be good to trigger emotion separately from politics. So we have people randomly assigned to these conditions where they look at a woman's face and we ask them, what emotion is this woman experiencing, and when was the last time you experienced that emotion? And they write some things down. That's the manipulation. Okay, so in the anger condition, they're on the left. They say, well, my roommate left the dishes in the sink for the 40th time, and I really hate that, and that pisses me off. And on the right, they say actually some pretty literally scary things, like my partner keeps threatening me, or things like that. So usually not about politics, but really scary things potentially. When we look at the comparison of the effect of sexism in these different conditions, what we find in the red is the power of sexism in the anger condition. The power of sexism in the anger condition is maximized. It's compared to the control. And the power of sexism in the fear condition is reduced compared to the control. So when you make people afraid, you're pulling them away from their sexist predispositions as a predictor of Trump. And afraid sexists are actually less likely to vote for Trump than angry sexists. And this is also true for the other predispositions that we look at, but it's a little bit less true because the other predispositions are not quite as powerful as sexism. Okay, so sorry I've taken up so much time. I thought this was going to be 15 minutes, but maybe I took longer. Sexism, powerful. Anger, not fear, is the catalyst that we're interested in. And the role of gender, therefore, and gender-based attitudes should not be ignored in 2016. Probably not should not be ignored in any year, but especially in 2016, we think it's not getting enough attention. Thank you very much.